This is episode 56 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Welcome to episode 56 of Ethics and Culture Cast from Notre Dame's Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm Ken Hellenius, the communications specialist at the center. In this episode, we sit down with Joshua Hren, the publisher of Wiseblood Books, author of How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, and co-founder of a new MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas that focuses on the Catholic imagination. Let's sit down together for this wide-ranging and fascinating conversation. Well, Joshua, thank you so much for coming to be on Ethics and Culture Cast. We're delighted to welcome you.
It's a pure joy to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you study? Kind of those sorts of things.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so thoroughly in the Midwest and in a city that is gritty, which immediately kind of exposed me to all sorts of stories that were waiting to happen. And that I think, stirred some of the city's innate kind of tensions, stirred my moral imagination at a very young age. And I did everything that I could to remain here as long as possible, and in fact was committed to living here forever. And then ended up leaving at the age of 33, just because as an itinerant professor, you kind of have to go where the work is, or you have to, return to being a waiter. And at that point, I think we had 3 children. So we ended up leaving, but we did just recently, in the last 2 weeks, really return home after 7 years of an odyssey away. So Milwaukee is very much in my bones, and I absolutely love the city in spite of all of its grittiness and the underbelly.
And are you a Brewers fan?
I know that this is the 8th deadly sin, but I'm not so much a fan of professional sports. I would rather watch my son play at the baseball diamond down the street, kind of guy. But my wife is a religious Packer devotee.
Okay.
She has Brett Favre stained glass in the living room. And when the Packers play, I take the children out of the house in case, there are things flying across the room if they lose. So she's very committed.
She picks up the slack for.
That's right. She's a card-carrying member of the political religion.
You make reference to being an itinerant kind of professor, go where the jobs are. What is your particular area of interest? Where did you do your studies?
So I did my studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I had no intention actually after graduating high school to go to college. This was sort of before it was obligatory basically for everyone to go, or there was a sense that, you kind of have to do this or you'll fail in life. That was just before that sort of push. And so my intention was to become a carpenter first. That didn't work out. Tried to be a nurse. That didn't work out. And then I had barely graduated high school, barely squeezed through with a P in physical education. So I just didn't think college was for me. And I instead began to write a lot of poetry and spent a lot of time with a group of poets in Milwaukee who hung out at a coffee shop, especially on Sundays. And at this point, I had left the church, and it had become something of a liturgy where there were just these knockdown, drag out, extraordinarily beautiful and intense poetry readings that would go on for hours and hours and hours. Some of these were people who hung out with Ginsberg and Kerouac, so they're kind of the real deal, almost like, for me at that age, second-class relics. And so I knew that I loved writing, but I didn't really know what to do with it. And around this time, my girlfriend was in college, and she was in a creative writing class and had a fiction assignment due and had to work that evening. And so she asked me if I could write the story for her, which I did. And it was a very kind of romantic scene. Literally, there's, I'm sitting at a coffee shop. I was probably making, less, maybe $600 a month or something like that, waiting tables and writing, the candles burning, and I'm writing on a napkin this story for her called A Raindrop Needs Rain. And she showed it to her professor, who beamed and said, and this is the best thing that anyone's turned in for years in my class. How did you come up with this? And what was your inspiration? And she lied through her teeth and related his response to me. And that convinced me that I should give college a try. And very soon I became one of those students who was hanging out like an acolyte with the professor after every class, trying to pick up the crumbs that fell from their lecture and their table. And I, again, tried to sort of escape the fate of academia. After undergraduate, I worked as a chaplain to the homeless with some Franciscan Capuchins in Milwaukee, and also at a charter school, Catholic school, in the kind of the inner city. But over time, I have found that I would get off of work and then just sort of immerse myself in writing fiction or poetry or reading philosophy. And again, maybe it's just my own narrow experience, but there just aren't that many places for the life of the mind and for the arts outside of academia right now in this country. And so I, again, sort of reluctantly returned to complete my PhD also at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, focusing on religion, literature, political philosophy and literature, and then fiction writing as well.
Wow. That is quite the journey.
It most certainly was, yeah. And we did the very Catholic thing of, having 2 kids before I finished a doctorate. So.
Well, now, so was it kind of that moment writing as writing a romantic story for somebody else, ghostwriting, I guess? That isn't even ghostwriting, really, is it? I mean, it's just...
You can't even dignify it with that. It was just plagiarism.
Was that, do you think, when you discovered that you had fallen in love with writing and literature?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I knew that I had a proclivity towards writing at a much younger age. I wrote my first novel, quote unquote novel, in 4th grade, and it was a 96-page, really awful imitation of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. In fact, I wish I could still find it in the old attic, but I haven't been able to traipse upon it. And my parents would actually regularly come into my room and say, we're really worried about you. You need to get out. You need to roll around in the grass and get into a wrestling match with a neighbor or something like that. And, I think that they as they put it to me, they were concerned that sort of my commitment to fiction was overtaking my sense of reality, even at a very young age. And, that then I hadn't read Don Quixote yet at that time, but it's sort of, I guess that makes me one of his adopted great grandchildren. So I knew that I was sort of had a proclivity toward it, and that continued into my teens when I would go to parties with a notebook and literally just curl up in a corner and start writing. And I'm sure some of that was just sort of the posure of, right, like I want to be a writer, because why else would you go stand in a room where you're supposed to be interacting with other people and turn away from them to write? But there was also a kind of, I can only describe it like Plato does, as a kind of divine madness, in the sense that there was something that would just overcome me. And I felt like I literally had to write or I would lose my mind. And to a certain extent, that holds true to this day. Right? So I'm a much kinder person, achieving some faint semblance of holiness if I write. But if I don't, then I get curmudgeon-y. So.
Now, you're the publisher of Wiseblood Books, which is how we at the center first came to know you. What is Wiseblood's inspiration and mission?
So I founded Wiseblood in 2013 accidentally on the feast day of Blessed James Ducat, without realizing that he's one of the patrons of Catholic publishing, living during the time of recusants and sort of illegitimate Catholics in England. And I founded it sort of after having failed at a barista interview to secure gainful employment for my family. This was after my doctorate, and I'd sent out over 100 applications to various universities, and there were 100 to 200 applicants for every one of those positions at that time. And I came back from that interview where they said that I was overqualified, and thought, finally I can get rid of this Catholic guilt, which is also just sort of parental guilt of I need to do whatever I can possibly do to practically speaking, to support my family, because I had tried that already. And so I did something much riskier, which was to found a press with, a couple $100 in a savings account. And I did this because I was working as an editor of Dappled Things, which is a Catholic literary magazine, and I was coming across a lot of really well-made, truthful, beautiful stories that were kind of hashing out a new idiom in the Catholic literary tradition right before my eyes. And when I began to correspond with these authors, they regularly sang the same refrain, which was, we tried to go to New York to break into the establishment and to get our work published, and we can't find an agent or a publisher who will represent us or take us seriously. And initially I worried that maybe there was some, as Nietzsche calls, ressentiment there, right, of sort of, these are artists who are decent and good, but they're just not that great, and so that's why they're not breaking through. But as I read more and more of their work, I was persuaded that there was actually a vacuum, right, in our culture, so that, there's this sort of division that on the one hand, you have serious Catholics who are bad artists, and on the other hand, you have capacious artists who have capitulated their faith. And I found that either or to be repudiated right before my eyes. I also found it to be confirmed in a lot of the submissions that we received for Dappled Things and also over the years for Wiseblood. And so I understand where that kind of stereotype comes from, because it's a serious problem. There's a lot of really bad Christianese, quote unquote, art that is, sort of does a disservice to the faith. But because I found enough of these authors who were disproving that stereotype, I launched the press, and it happened to launch at the exact same time, unbeknownst to me, that Dana Gioia, the former chairman of the National Endowment of the Arts, and the Poet Laureate of California, had published The Catholic Writer Today and First Things, inciting a national conversation about the presence or lack thereof of Catholics in the literary sphere. And I wrote him a 14-page response to The Catholic Writer Today, taking issue with some of his points. Of course, all of my criticisms dissolved once he wrote back a very enthusiastic and warm letter that started and initiated a lifelong friendship and mentorship. But it also allowed us to be the publisher of the essay version, the monograph version of The Catholic Writer Today, which really helped put Wiseblood on the map. And since then, we've added to our line a number of really reputable and incredible Catholic writers, ranging from our Reno, editor of First Things, who wrote a long essay, a monograph on Henry James for us, to the Catholic political philosopher Pierre Manent, who I think the Center for Ethics and Culture also just recently published his book on natural law, which I think,
correct,
which I really love. And then also Michael O'Brien, the Canadian Catholic novelist. Among them also a number of sort of upstart Catholic novelists, I guess we could call them, and poets like James Matthew Wilson, right? Now he's much better known, but when we first published his work, that wasn't the case. And then Lee Ozer, who's written a couple novels for us, a College of the Holy Cross professor, as well as Glenn Arbery, who's the president of Wyoming Catholic College and also a novelist. He's written 2 novels, and
Wow.
his third is forthcoming.
Wow. What a story. That's awesome.
Yes.
Well, now tell us a little bit about your own writing. You've published award-winning collections of short stories. By the way, congratulations on In the Wine Press winning first place at the Catholic Media Association Book Awards last week. I don't.
You're
know
not
if
serious.
I'm quite serious. Am I breaking the news to you?
No, I had no idea.
Congratulations. Indeed. I was flipping through because the center had a couple books that also took awards. But when I see and recognize familiar names, I took a little screenshot. I'll share it with you a little later.
Thanks be to God. And thanks for telling me.
You're welcome. Oh my gosh. Yes.
It reminds me a little bit of, right, wasn't when Notre Dame was founded, didn't the brothers who founded it, so they wrote back home to ask permission to found the school, and then they did it sort of anyways while they're waiting for a reply, and then the reply came back no. So maybe there's a carrier pigeon, sort of that will fly up to the window any second now, bearing the news. But thank you so much.
Yes, no, congratulations. It took first place in anthologies.
Oh, thanks to God, yeah.
Yes, indeed. That's congratulations. You've also written a novel other than the one that you did when you were in 4th grade. You also have a book about Tolkien and political philosophy. And now you have a survey of Catholic literature and kind of a beginning introduction to writing. Where does your inspiration come from? Who are your audiences?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, again, it shifts depending upon the book. I think that the book on Tolkien was a way of sort of trying to be a good scholar and a good dad at the same time, because it allowed me to read The Lord of the Rings to my children twice, I think, in 1 year.
Wow.
While also writing a book on it. And it also allowed me to sort of purge, exercise, expiate my soul and my mind of a lot of the sort of academies that I picked up in graduate school. But also, in a more serious vein, to apply this sort of virtue ethics approach to literature, or the ethical imagination, that I really picked up from reading Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, which was a book I think I've mentioned to you that altered my life entirely. There was a sort of before and after, where I didn't really believe that we're capable of virtue. I believe we're driven by these dominant passions. And then after reading McIntyre, I did an about face and began to apply some of the ways that he looks at narrative and the imagination to Tolkien. And that's the sort of the genesis of the Tolkien book. Then with the short stories in the novel, what I'm trying in terms of audience, it's difficult to say, because I regularly have these conversations with friends where you say, there aren't that many sort of Catholics who are interested in literary fiction. And there aren't that many readers of literary fiction at all in this country anymore. I think, the NEA stats have given us some pretty dismal tea leaves to chew on, right? When they sort of say that, last 15, 20 years, the amount of American adults who are college educated, who have read even a single book of poems or novel in a year has dwindled by like 50% or more. So there's a way in which what I'm up to in fiction might be kind of, I fear, falling between the two bar stools. But another way of looking at it that's more hopeful is that it's sort of trying to carve out that new idiom that I was mentioning earlier, that others like Glenn Arbery and Trevor Merrill, author of Minor Indignities, which is an incredible novel that came out last year, as well as Christopher Beha and Katie Carl. There are a number of other younger Catholic writers who I think are sort of collectively forging this new idiom that does not compromise excellence or craft at all, and that also takes the depths and the cosmic nature of the Catholic vision and renders it in a way that it accords with the particular sort of idiosyncrasies of our age. So that's sort of what the fiction is really trying to do. And then in terms of how to read and write like a Catholic, I mean, I wanted this to be a book that your Aunt Dymphna could pick up and read with some degree of pleasure. And I also, love teaching. I love my students. I toss and turn over their lives and their souls, every night, and I rejoice with their successes. And a lot of the book came out of experiences in the classroom, insights that were hard won in conversations and Socratic seminars. And it actually emerged, more practically speaking, out of having published a couple of the chapters in First Things, and then being approached by the publisher of TAN, who had read some of those essays and said, this is something that I've long kind of wanted someone to explain to me, right? I don't understand Flannery O'Connor, frankly, he said, right? I know that I'm supposed to love her, but I actually kind of am scared of her. So can you kind of justify the ways of Flannery O'Connor to man? And can you maybe also introduce us to some other Catholic writers who are maybe unsung, relatively speaking? And so I tried to do that, but along the way also wanted to make the case that for Catholics, right, the importance of literature goes far beyond just reading works that are written by Catholics. It also it extends across a kind of pendulum swing from St. John Henry Newman, the only canonized novelist saint, who argues that literature is primarily a study of a record of man in rebellion, right? So it's a study of human nature, of sort of natural man, as he puts it, outside of the action of grace on the one hand. But then if you swing to the other extreme, you have Dante in Paradiso, right? Taking us all the way up the ladders of the celestial heavens until we can get as close as we possibly can, pushing through the limits of our senses until we can't do any more to see the beatific vision, right? And so the Catholic imagination swings back and forth through that kind of study of sin. And that study of sin, as Flannery O'Connor puts it, is an approach that does not reduce evil to a problem to be solved. It's not a sort of just a mere moral problem. It's not just a chemical problem. It's not just something that can be sort of weeded out and fixed. It's, as O'Connor says, a mystery to be endured. And so a lot of Catholic writers of repute, right, sort of that is what they do best, right, is convince us that evil is real, that demons exist, right, and that a couple could be sitting in their living room quarreling about the heating bills, but they're not just sort of having a marital spat. They're actually eternal things that are happening, and there are things in the scales of the final judgment which are sort of just barely perceptible on the periphery of that scene. And so the Catholic writer sort of allows us to see that. But somewhere in between the two extremes is someone like Flannery O'Connor, who argues that all of her stories are about the action of grace on characters who are not very willing to support that action of grace. And isn't that really an apt way of explaining most of our lives, right? We go to confession, and then we go to confession again and confess the same sins. We receive communion, and then we allow our tongues to be organs of divisiveness between ourselves and our brothers, right? And so the Catholic imagination can kind of convince us of that and make it perceptible, and also sort of give us tragedies that make us want to avoid living out those same tragedies in our own lives. But beyond that, Catholics can also very profitably read Homer and Shakespeare and someone like Balzac, right? Who, these are writers who are studying just human ambition. And they may or may not be Catholic. Their commitments to the faith are in question. But that does not prevent us from learning a great deal from their sort of uncensored and wide-eyed sort of study of what it means to be alive and to try to be humane. And then finally, there's a section in the book on sort of Christ-haunted writers. So this would be someone like James Joyce, who formally became an apostate, but he would secretly sneak to the Easter Vigil every year. And he was in love with the liturgy, I think, until his dying day. Someone like George Saunders, who's a living writer of great repute and prestige, who attributes his understanding of art to the Latin Mass of his childhood, even though he now is a kind of self-proclaimed syncretist, kind of Buddhist Christian. To also to someone like Flaubert, right, the great, one of the greatest modern fictionists, who described himself as a mystic at bottom who believes in nothing, but who gives us in his story A Simple Heart a portrait of a beautiful soul that a lot of his friends thought he was treating sort of ironically. Here's this idiot peasant lady, they thought, right, who mistakes a parrot for the Holy Spirit. Ha ha ha, Flaubert, well done, right? You've shown that religion is an illusion. And he said, absolutely not. That's not what I was trying to do. I was trying to get you to take her seriously because, right, I see myself in her. I see all of us in her. And so please do not laugh at her. I want you to weep, right, over her fate. And so that's the sort of the scope of the book. And then it ends with a sort of how-to in terms of just how to write, first of all, especially how to write fiction. And those are insights gleaned from teaching the art of fiction over the years. And then also more pointedly how to write as a Catholic.
So that right there actually draws out a question. You say to write as a Catholic. The title of your book is How to Read and Write Like a Catholic. Is there a distinction to be drawn between like and as? Because one can write like a Catholic or one can write as a Catholic.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good distinction. I would say that on the one hand, right, I wanted to make it clear that I'm distancing myself a little bit from any sort of totalizing systematic theory, right? And that is precisely because I could not possibly contain in one volume, right, all that it means to write as a Catholic. And so I wanted to really have the title land on the note of analogy, right, and metaphor. So this is sort of something of what it might look like, if that makes sense, more of that spirit. And it kind of comes from Aristotle's Poetics as well, where he privileges the sort of the mode of writing that we call history, which is focused on the sort of the particulars. This is just sort of what happened, compared to poetry, where we engage with sort of what might happen if we're dealing with this sort of character in this particular kind of situation, right? We begin with the particular, but then we move to the more expansive of it. It would look something sort of like this, right? So that's the mode that I was trying to operate in. But there's a number of distinctions that can be drawn between how to write well, just at all, and how to write as a Catholic. We take, for example, the modern novel. If Joseph Bottom is right, at least in part right, in arguing that modern fiction sort of takes as its end the character's self-actualization, right? It's sort of following the trajectory of a character from underdevelopment to self-actualization. The Catholic writer sees the completion of the story weighed in the measure of conversion, right? So It doesn't mean that Catholic writers always need to tell stories where someone moves from sin into salvation or surety of salvation, but it means that they see the end of human life as a share in the beatific vision, as a participation in salvation rather than self-actualization, right? And so that's going to alter the kinds of details that you include in a story or that you occlude from a story. And it's also, right, going to mean that when a character departs from the faith in a story, that the central, what Henry James calls the central intelligence of the novel, will make us feel the pain of that departure, right? So Christopher Beha's What Happened to Sophie Wilder is a novel that does this really well. It was written, I think, published in 2012, and it was right on the cusp of Beha's own return to the Catholic faith of his childhood. He wasn't Catholic yet, but it tells the story of Sophie Wilder, this kind of New York literati figure who, as she puts it, feels like she's been occupied by God. And her whole life has to be radically altered because of this love affair with the Lord. And the narrator picks up on this love affair because he's in love with her. And he tries to make sense of this mysterious disappearance and preoccupation with something that seems archaic and foreign to him. And by the time the novel reaches its conclusion, as he begins to flirt with and move closer to some semblance of a Christian understanding of reality, Sophie herself moves away from the church and actually finds herself guilty of assisting someone's death and considers herself unforgiven by the final pages of the novel. So there are a number of ways in which Beha could have registered those same events, or any writer could tell the same story with the same plot, and it would be felt very differently for us, right? As sort of maybe not tragic that she left the faith. For example, this is a liberation, that she had great courage. Let's say, for example, I'm thinking of some of the existentialist, novels of the 20th century. She had great courage to embrace the absurdity and maybe even to commit suicide, right? That's a courageous act. But Beha doesn't filter it to us in that form, right? He, again, makes us realize that it's the saddest possible thing that she left her faith, right? And that she could have been forgiven, but that she herself decided that she herself was damned, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So that's just one instance of a way in which, a Catholic or someone with a Catholic sensibility will write.
I'm reminded of a frustration I experienced having read Silence by Endo and then seeing the movie. And I think the book is the Catholic vision, and the movie is very much that self-expression, self-actualization, because it ends and they make the wrong people the hero in the movie. They make the Jesuit the hero. And that's not at all what the story is trying to say.
That's right.
To me.
Yeah, no, and I think that is actually something that's worth mulling over or remarking upon, which is that, right, good fiction, good poetry, of course, too, but good fiction is innately charged with mystery, right? So that when you get to the end of Silence and you see the priest / defected former priest stomping upon the fumi, right? Stomping upon the image of Christ. There's a certain way in which we wanna, the sort of hyper moralistic part of ourselves wants to pronounce upon what's happening really quickly and easily, and he's either sort of readily condemned or readily to be commended. But any story worth its salt will leave a measure of mystery, not for the same reason. And I want to distinguish mystery here from ambiguity, if I could, because, you have sort of in modern fiction, a turn away from moralizing narrators, let's say someone like Dickens or Thackeray, who's always kind of telling you what to think about Little Dorrit or whatever, right? Like, this is how you're supposed to feel about her right now, and I'm going to conveniently tell you. And then you have sort of this turn with Henry James, especially towards a kind of a super subtle moral vision. That's still a moral vision, but at points you're left sort of just totally scratching your head because you're wandering around in these characters' consciousnesses, and you don't know up from down. And there's a way in which, especially in the late 20th century, that becomes just sort of total ambiguity, where there's an intentional attempt to portray humanity as sort of this lost total wayfarer that can't find its way home. But the Catholic vision, it can contain some measure of ambiguity, but again, it's more at its best, it's more appropriately called mystery. And what I mean by that is it's sort of like what St. Augustine says about Scripture, right? It's a difficult enough scene to understand that we have to activate all of our resources to try to make sense of it. But then once we do, right, we're totally engaged, and we're not going to be able to sleep because there's so much at stake. And so then we have to arrive at not just an answer, but the deepest possible way of reading this or understanding it. And so it begins in mystery, but it doesn't necessarily have to end there, right? It can end in some sort of reconciliation or resolution.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your new role, where you're once again putting your passion into practice, much like you did with Wiseblood. The Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, due to kick off this fall at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Now, you're creating this program, like right in front of our eyes, alongside poet and friend of the podcast, James Matthew Wilson. How did your partnership and this venture come about?
Sure. So I had no intention of leaving Belmont Abbey because I had 4 years ago co-founded an honors college there, Great Books Honors College, and was, having the time of my life. It was too good to be true, these incredible students and these great books. But last year, I had been giving a series of lectures and doing some readings from my short fiction in Texas. And one of my stops was in Houston. And at a long, leisurely, really beautiful dinner with so many good souls in the same room at the house of Sarah Cortez, who's the founder of Catholic Literary Arts there. I sort of just off the cuff, in this conversation about Catholicism and culture, said, well, I really think that if we're going to secure the gains that we've achieved in the last 10 years or so, since Dana Gioia wrote The Catholic Writer Today, and there have been all this flurry of conferences, and I said, we really need is an MFA, and an MFA that is totally and unabashedly Catholic in the capital C sense, and also Catholic in the small C sense, in that we welcome all comers, right? And that we can and need to forge an MFA that is willing to and capable of doing both. But that shows, I think, the radicality of the University of St. Thomas in Houston, who there were some people affiliated with the university at that dinner. And they immediately sort of ate up the idea and wanted a prospectus. They asked me to design the curriculum and articulate a vision for it. And that shows the radicality of their commitment to the reclaiming of their Catholic vision and mission of that school. I mean, who, at a time when many Catholic schools are totally axing their core educational commitments and getting rid of philosophy requirements and theology requirements, who is allowing someone to found an arts degree, right? So, right. I mean, it's almost comical, but in the divine sense. And it shows. I think it speaks volumes in praise of the president, Richard Ludwig, and the vice president for academic affairs, Chris Evans, and George Hren, who is our dean. They've all been totally supportive, not just in words, but in terms of budget as well. And I have to just say that aloud because, I've worked at Catholic institutions for the duration of my time in higher education. And it's not necessarily through anyone's fault, but typically, you're asked to make bricks without straw because there's no money to go around. And so the fact that they're willing to put money on the line really, again, is extraordinarily laudable. And then, so over the course of the last year, then I thought for sure the program would be axed because of COVID. But in fact, COVID was precisely the condition that I think allowed it to flourish, because more and more people are attending Zoom seminars and finding that, it might not be, it never will be able to take us into the perfections of incarnate education where we're all sitting around the same table, but there's still an awful lot you can accomplish. And especially in terms of writing, one of the things that convinced me that online education is good for this kind of program was reading the letters of Flannery O'Connor and Carolyn Gordon, her literary mentor and a fellow Catholic. And it's basically like an MFA, Master of Fine Arts in miniature, right? I mean, I think they may have met one another 2 times or something like that, but most of their relationship was just back and forth through letters. And it's Carolyn Gordon going through O'Connor's stories and saying, and a good man is hard to find. There's this part where you really don't cut it. And you can't do that anymore in the rest of your stories, and she tells her why. And point by point sort of goes through the merits and the weaknesses. And so we can do that. We can duplicate that. And we can add other voices to boot, right? So as Dana Joy said, when he was traveling around the country for over a decade, he kept hearing the same refrain from Catholics who are artists saying, I'm lonely. I don't know any other Catholics who are serious poets. I don't know people striving after holiness and trying to perfect the artistic habitus at the same time. And so I hope that no one will be able to say that in 5 years, right? Because if they're having that experience, they can enroll in the MFA, and they can do so as a full-time student. And, I know that this isn't a cheap price tag, but it's the most affordable, or one of the most affordable MFAs in the country right now at $18,000 for the whole degree, which I need to remind our listeners that means that someone can, for $18,000, receive this really high-level education and come out with a degree that allows them to teach at the college level. But if life circumstances don't allow a full immersion, then you can just sign up for one of our poetry workshops with James Matthew Wilson for $1,800, right? And make it a once and done sort of thing. And even that will bring you into this sort of cross-pollination with like-minded souls who love literature and who love the Lord.
Wow. Well, best of luck in that program. It sounds amazing. And I saw the list of kind of contributing writers and poets that you're going to have involved as well. It's very impressive. And we'll put a link in the show notes as well to the homepage for the program.
Yeah. I mean, I that's another thing where I've experienced this sort of disbelief, in terms of the swell of support that was shown by people like Roger or Sora Bamari, right, who readily volunteered to give guest lectures, right, or Christopher Beha, right, was very willing to come and talk to one of my fiction classes.
Wow, fun. Well, let's end with a little practical takeaway. You end your book, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, with 2 appendices that list hundreds of books that you recommend, both those that are explicitly Catholic and what you call further forays for the high achiever to continue their self-education and kind of self-familiarity. I love your disclaimer at the end of the first part of the list. You say, quote, "Will you, dear reader, ever forgive me for the brevity of this list, for its radical incompleteness?" So what are maybe 2 or 3 books that the average person should read right now just to get started? And you can't say the Bible because we're going to assume they're already doing that, and especially Tobit, my absolutely favorite book.
You love Tobit as well?
It is the best story ever. Yes.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, I appreciate you, sort of forbidding the Bible card because again, it's also not fair, right? Because it's more than one book in one, right?
Yeah. You point out in your footnote, it's 73 books. So, I mean, that's already a library on its own.
Yeah, I would say so for someone who's sort of on the fence in terms of not really understanding literature and wanting to love it, not really getting it, I would say don't start with Flannery O'Connor. Start with maybe Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed, a novel, actually really sort of the first modern Catholic novel. I can't recommend it enough. I'm reading it with my children right now. And, there are all these wonderful moments where you can sort of collectively laugh, cathartically laugh as a family, where there's a sort of a priest who's described as tolerating his housekeeper, who's also described as tolerating the priest. And then you can sort of turn to your children and say, yeah, isn't that the case here too, my friends? And we all sort of laugh together. So Manzoni's The Betrothed, I would also strongly recommend, in terms of something older for our amnesiac age, Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. Again, if you haven't read it. So I would say those two, and maybe Kristen Lavransdottir's by Sigrid Undset as places to start. And Undset, especially if you're a parent, and even more particularly if you're a mother or a daughter, it will be a life-altering experience passing through that very long book that is nonetheless hard to put down. If you want to go back further, I can't say enough about opening up the Divine Comedy of Dante and just trying to read, a canto, maybe a canto a night if that's too much, a canto a week. And what that could look like is read it once really quickly and then read that same canto very slowly with a good set of notes by anyone from Ciardi to Dorothy Sayers to Hollander, right? All good notes, to Anthony Esselin's notes. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting the right notes, and it's actually not as difficult as it might first fearfully be, nor is Aristotle's Poetics. It's one of his shortest. And I would say if you can, just read Anthony Kenny's translation of that, he sort of breaks it down into sections, bite-sized pieces. That's good. Those are all good places to start. In terms of then finally, some, again, maybe undersung works that have been written in the last 10 years that are worth looking at. Christopher Beha's What Happened to Sophie Wilder. Also, maybe his Index of Self-Destructive Acts, which just came out last year. Dana Gioia's 99 Poems, his collected poems. And Trevor Merrill's Minor Indignities, which I realize is a Wiseblood book. And so I'm biased because it's sort of like saying, you're proud of one of your children. What parent isn't? But in terms of a novel that's been appreciated, everywhere from sort of mom blogs to, sort of periodicals on post-liberalism, right? So it's gotten really good reception from a wide range of readers, from like Theology of Home, to people who are like Joshua Hochschild, who are not going to have mercy, if there's any sort of weaknesses on the literary level. Minor Indignities has really succeeded, so I can't recommend it highly enough.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for those recommendations, and congratulations on the book and on the MFA program and on making it back home to Milwaukee and all of that kind of good stuff that seems to, as you say, one of these days you're going to wake up from the dream, but until then, keep enjoying it.
Thank you. Yeah. Maybe if I do wake up from the dream, maybe I'll just remain in a kind of somnambulous sort of state, right? even afterwards. And either way, whether waking or sleeping, I can't wait until the next time we get to have a conversation, Ken, because you're such a good host, and I'm just so unspeakably grateful to you for taking the time to go through a kind of really wide-ranging conversation here that increases my gratitude to God. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Professor Joshua Hren. In the show notes, you will find links to his books, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, and his award-winning collection of short stories, In the Wine Press, as well as more information about the new MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. Subscribe to Ethics and Culture Cast so that you can always get the latest episodes by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu/podcast. We would love your feedback. Please review the show on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts, and email your suggestions to cecpodcast@nd.edu. Our theme music is I Don't Know by Grapes, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. We'll see you next time here on Ethics and Culture Cast. Until then, make good decisions.